Hello.
Hello. Okay, there we are. Hello.
Hello. Trump freed another prisoner.
Oh, from Russia, the Russian guy?
Is he Jewish, Fogel?
I think so. Yeah.
I can't
Wh-
tell.
Where did they catch him? Why was he there? What's the?
Marijuana possession.
Oh,
Like 17 grams of marijuana.
he did.
Yeah, so they sentenced her 14 years
Uh-huh.
for distribution of narcotics. Crazy.
What page are we?
I have 253.
Oh.
Is that right?
Close to what I have, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Typical labors in Shinui.
Good evening, everybody.
Hi.
Hi, Jacob.
Hi. For you.
I believe we are on 253.
Yeah, that's correct. That's what I have.
Okay. Typical labors and shinui. So in addition to the specific, last week we started talking about the Lamites Malachos. We talked about Av and Tolda. We talked about the Raisa and Rabbanon. That's sort of the beginning discussion. So in addition to the specific terms which define each individual malacha deraisa, all the malachos are also defined by overarching general principles which define whether a given act constitutes a malacha deraisa as follows. Any given act of malacha is forbidden by the Torah only when performed as a mlechas machsheves, a deliberate constructive act that must fulfill these general conditions. If a forbidden action does not meet these conditions, it will be forbidden, but only midrabanan, and in some cases permitted. And we will review those conditions that we're talking about that either makes something a malechas machshavas or not. Now, the first condition we will discuss relates to the conventional or typical performance of the malacha. Midoraisa, one is liable for having performed a prohibited labor only if it was performed in its typical manner, without a notable shinui, a change. Just think about it. Let's say we talked about zoreya, seeding or plowing. So let's say normally you do it with your right hand, but instead you do it with your left hand, or you do it walking backwards. So that's very typical for what we will say is a shinui. It's not the normal way of doing the malacha. And it wouldn't be permitted to do, but if two eidim saw you do that or warned you, you wouldn't get, it would not, you wouldn't bring a show, you wouldn't bring a korban if you did it b'shogeg, and you wouldn't be killed if you did it, but it's not permitted to do. But you wouldn't fulfill the full criteria of the malacha. The Gemara in Masechta Shabbos discusses this principle in the context of writing. So, akosev shtei oisios. You write two letters, bein b'yamino, bein b'smolo, whether you write with your right hand or your left hand, bein mishem echad, bein mishtei shemos. You wrote two olives, or you wrote aleph and bet. Bein mishtei samanios, or he uses different inks. And b'chol lashon, whether you do it in Hebrew, whether you do it in any language, it's chayiv. So, bishlama ayamin l'chayiv. So the Gemara's comment on the Mishnah is, well, I understand why you should be chayiv for writing with your right hand. That's the normal way a person writes if you're right-handed. Mishum d'derech ksivuk ela smol amai. So the Gemara is wondering, why did the Mishnah say that you'd be chayiv for writing with your left hand? Ha'ein derech ksivuk b'kach. Rabbi Yehuda be'itr yad shanu. When the Mishnah said that if a person, bein b'smolo, it refers to a left-handed person whose normal writing is with his left hand. Comes out from this Gemara that a right-handed person who writes with his left hand, or a left-handed person to write, which is with his right hand, would not be chayiv. So the Gemara grants that if a righty writes with the left, this is considered a shinui, and the person is not chayiv midoraisa. He's not allowed to do it. Now, by the way, these things come in, as you can imagine. Let's say as a doctor, when you're on call on Shabbos, and you had to write an order. So, and you couldn't do it verbally. You had to write it. So writing it with your left hand is a shinui. It's not permitted to do it, but it's only forbidden mid'Rabbanan. And if you're dealing with somebody with a chola, with a chola, so having a chola as well as mid'Rabbanan, that could be permitted, or you would not be chayiv. Okay, chola sheyesh bo sakana, you can do it with your right hand. Chola she'ein bo sakana, perhaps with a rabbinic, which you're allowed to violate a rabbinic law, but not the Raisa law. So doing something b'shinoi is something that is important to understand. As cited by the Mishnah, Borachai Adam expands upon this Gemara's analysis. The Gemara distinguishes between the right and left hand regarding writing, but for other labors, executing them with the other hand is not considered a shinui. However, it would be considered a shinui to perform other labors with one's foot, mouth, or elbow. So, so that which we said before, like plowing or seeding or any of the other malachas, there is no ptur by doing it with your left hand if you're a righty. Only by writing do you have this. Is there an exemption? But baraglo, bepiv, umarafko, with his elbow or his mouth or his foot, mashvasham de potter v'aser. So there you'd have it would only be chayiv. You'd only be, it's potter of a loser. Potter means you're potter from a korban because it's not doraisa, but it's also midrabanan to do. The Gemara Masechta Shabbos notes that it's also considered a shinui to carry a burden upon one's head. Hamotzi masui al rosho patun. So we know you cannot carry from a reshus hayachid into a reshus harabim, or you may not carry dalid amos b'reshus harabim. Now, what if you carried it on your head? So the Gemara Masech Shabbos says you're potter. V'im timtzalamer anshe hutzel oisin kain. The people of Hutzel, this was apparently their normal way of carrying things. So, but kolodam. Most people don't carry. So since the majority of human beings don't carry on their head, even though there's a certain place where people do carry on their heads, that doesn't make it normative. And therefore it would be potter to carry something on your head. In other words, even if the people of Hutzel are used to carrying something on their head, it's still defined as performing a prohibited labor with a shinui. Since most of the world, that's an atypical way to carry things. According to the Or Zaru and the Ben Ish Chai, I'm reading the footnote, it is not considered a halachic shinui to perform a malacha in an unusual manner when the result is the same. On the other hand, the Eglei Tal maintain that such a deviation from the usual method is still considered a shinui, even if the result is identical. This issue is extremely relevant to many practical situations, such as turning on a light or pressing a button on a phone or elevator in case of a patient whose life is in danger, or other situations of pikuach nefesh. In such a case, the result is identical whether one performs the action normally with a shinui, such as one's elbow, meaning you want to press the elevator button. The result is the same whether you pressed it with your finger, you press it with your elbow. So now we're coming to this machlokas achronim between the Ben Ish Chai and the Eglei Tal, whether or not, if the result is the same, it's still usher, versus the Eglei Tal who says that it still remains a shinui. It seems that if there are no other methods of shinui to use, it's preferable you to use the methods described even if no change occurs in the result, as one has reduced the severity of the prohibition, at least according to some opinions. Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa brings that as well. The principles of shinui contain important practical relevance when confronted with a situation of danger to life on Shabbos. According to a well-established halachic principle, the preservation of life supersedes almost every single mitzvah in the Torah. Thus, as acknowledged by all poskim, Chazal clearly stated that it is a mitzvah, it's required to violate Shabbos in order to save the life of someone who's in danger. See, for example, the Mishnah Masechta Yoma, Rambam Hilchos Shabbos. Generally speaking, saving a life permits every prohibition in the Torah except idolatry, murder, and forbidden relations. This will be discussed later, Pikuach Nefesh, in detail. Now, this granted, however, the poskim write that there is some preference for violating Shabbos in the mildest forms, so long as this does not increase the risk of anyone's safety. And this is something I'm very well acquainted with once I started my medical career, that we were always taught to try to minimize violation of Shabbos as much as you can, even if you're dealing with a chola sheyesh bo sakona. Now, if it's a chola sheyesh bo sakona and doing something with a shinui is going to damage. So, for example, if you have to operate on somebody on Shabbos, you're not going to do it in a shinui. You have to do it in the most careful, correct way, if that's going to save his life. So, nobody is going to say to do something with a shinui, thereby lessening the prohibition, if it's going to impact what you're doing. If it has no impact and you can accomplish it by shinui, like I said, writing it with your left hand when it doesn't make a difference, you're just giving an order which is going to be carried out in exactly the same way, but you've done it in a more minimal way, or just amira rather than writing, telling the nurse to do something. You can give verbal orders, and that also minimizes the prohibition. This relates to our discussion of the concept of shinui. The more lenient status of a labor performed with the shinui is critical when someone is ill, or there are other extenuating circumstances, such as important security needs. Thus, unlike the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramon Mishnah Berurah rule that if one is caring for someone who is dangerously ill on Shabbos, it is preferable, when safely possible, to perform any prohibited labors with a shinui. as then the labor is only rabbinically prohibited. So the Shulchan Aruch in Shin Chav Ches says, "K'shemechalin Shabbos al Chodesh yesh b'sach shakona, mishtadlin shlo lasos ayidei eno Yehudi." You should do it yourself. You shouldn't do it with a goy. Uktani v'noshim. El ayidei Yisraelim gedolim uvnei das. As explained by the Meforshim, including the Mishnah Berurah, Shulchan Aruch rules that it's preferable for adult Jewish males to perform the necessary violations of Shabbos in these cases, so that there will be no hesitation to perform these tasks, and it will be clear to everyone that the labors are permitted. We don't want any delay, calling a goy or whatever. So God will be Yisrael. It needs to be violate Shabbos, and you notice the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say anything about Shinui. Says the Ramov Yeshoimim Dim Efshar Lasos Below Dichui V'lo Ichal Yedei Shinui. If you can do it without delay or postponement through a Shinu, Oisa Yedei Shinu. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Uvlo Ichla Yedei Shinu, the Kol Kama Dunuchal Asot Beheter Lo Shavki Yeter V'Nasa B'Isser. As long as we can do something in a more permissible manner, better to do it that way without prohibition or with less prohibition. V'nira duadin imayidei Shinu mitachra davar ma'at. Let's say there's a little delay. Rak de'ena choyli bohu. Rak de'ena choyli bohu nami mitachri ma'at. As long as the illness doesn't become exacerbated, so you can still delay it a little bit. Because then you're violating only rabbinic law and not Torah law. The Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, Rav Neuwirth, who we will be referencing a lot in this in the next 7-8 volumes of Shabbos. So Rav Neuwirth's psak are pretty much based primarily on Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So Kishbechalin says Shabbos Latzolos Chaye Adam. Yesh Lemay Kol Efshar Basiyas Yisurim. Of course, as an Ashkenazi posek, he follows the Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah that you should try to minimize as much as you can, the prohibited labors. As long as it will not lead to a deterioration of the chola's status. If you can save the person by only committing a rabbinic prohibition, it's also lavar l'isur Torah. Then the prohibition in Torah remains. Something that is prohibited that you can do b'shinui, which is not the normal way you would do it. Yaseu b'shinui, you should do it. Let's say you're going to do something that you would normally do, let's say carrying something outside from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, or you're in Rosh Hashanah, you want to carry Dal Damas. Two people carrying something that normally is not carried by two people. We're talking about like a very small box. So you're carrying it if you do it yourself, but if you do it with two people, that's less of an issur. If you don't have another person there who can do it with you, now let's say normally you carry a letter with one hand. So if you have to, or whatever it is that you're carrying normally with one hand, carry it with two hands. Which is different than the way you normally would do it. B'chol mikra, arshe yeshboch shash kol shehu, shagbalot hamarot alulot lavi lidei ikuv v'nezek betipul b'chol sheb'sakana. If any of these calculations that you're thinking about are going to lead to potential harm to the chola, then forget about it. Or shel yichlash biglalan, or you'll be weakened. Yesh li talemen, just ignore it. V'yesh la'asot l'tovat hachol et kol kvimot hachol kedei latzilo. In order to save the chola, you should do it in a normal fashion. This line of reasoning is based upon the premise that the halachos of Shabbos merely defer to the needs of the emergency situation. If the needs are not quite immediately urgent, and one has time to responsibly perform the forbidden act in a manner which lessens the stringency of the act, the halachas of Shabbos demand that they be done in the more lenient way. The Yalkut Yosef cites some achronim who say that the halachas of Shabbos are categorically permitted for the sake of saving a life, and thus there is no need for a shinui at all. See Kaf HaChaim and the Or L'Tzion who support performing necessary labor normally. In the halachic literature, these two opposing positions relate to the question of whether Shabbos is dechuya or hutra. This is the chakira when someone's life is threatened. Okay, everything is off. Everything is lifted. It's mutter. No, it's just dochui. It's pushed to the side as much. It's pushed rather than completely permitted, and therefore you have to try to do it in a shinui dika way. So yesh oimrim, says the Yalkut Yosef, shekasher mechalin Shabbos l'chol sheyesh b'sakona, tzarich lasos hamlacha b'shinui. Of course, he's quoting the Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah. And don't do it kedarkan, v'lo kedarkan. As long as imein adavar gorm shum chashash iko v'sofik sakona, as long as it doesn't lead to further endangering. V'lachen kemish mitalfenim b'shabbat l'tzorch pikuach nefesh. Yesh larim et hashafrot b'shinui. Let's say you're calling somebody, calling paramedics. You should do it with your left hand, could go to, or with your elbow, could go to Alidei Meravko. V'yesh omim shlo hutzrechu shinui. There are those that say that it doesn't require shinui. Ela kisheois l'tzorch yoledes, u'v'mokom she'efshar. If you're calling for a woman in labor, so there, maybe you could make a little bit. The Yalkut Yosef going more like the Shulchan Aruch, like they usually do, where he didn't say anything about shinui. That's how the Sephardi poskim are coming down. These principles apply not only to cases of illnesses, but to other cases where there is a threat to life, including natural disasters, security threats, or war. In Israel, while the October 7th massacres were unfolding and in the ensuing war in many areas, people were called upon to turn on radios or cell phones and to carry guns, which might have been put aside in storage on Shabbos. The following is an excerpt from the instructions issued by the chief rabbinate of Israel concerning emergency measures touching upon the violation of Shabbos. We can't get more relevant than these halachas. The instructions were publicized on many websites, including www.srugim. Okay. B'chol beit knesset, yesh laniach me'erev Shabbos machshir telephone patuach. From an Erev Shabbos, they should leave an open phone line. Sheyeh zamin lazik et kochot hachirum, that'll be available to call emergency services. I'll call tzar shelo sofo if something happens. Nite lazik celulari al matzav ratat bakis. You can keep a cell phone in your pocket in a vibrate mode. Mi sheyesh lo neshek b'rishayon, whoever has licensed firearms, mitzvah she'yisa oto as a neshek gam b'Shabbos. It's a mitzvah to carry that weapon on Shabbos. Gam in b'derech klal hu lo somech ala iru. Even if he's machmir, doesn't usually use the eru. One of the 39 forbidden labors is moving articles between private and public sphere, as well as carrying articles from one spot to another within the public space. Due to this malacha, which will be discussed in future volumes, it is essentially prohibited to carry or move anything at all from any building to the public space and vice versa, as well as to as well as to carry things when one is outside. However, all of the space within a properly constructed and maintained eruv has the status of a large shared private space that's permitted to carry within the boundaries if there's a proper eruv chatzeros. Because the halachic details of the eruv are extremely complicated and are subject to significant disputes, some individuals are stringent to refrain from carrying in some places which are enclosed by Eruvin. Famously, Rav Moshe Feinstein held that the Manhattan could not have an Eruv made in it because there were so many people there, population, more than 600,000. So there were stringencies. Some people to this day will not use the Eruv in certain places because they're considered too populated. Others, there have been more heterim since Rav Moshe Paskin.
Chabad doesn't use the Erev at all. Chabad does not use an Erev.
Okay, so there are certainly people that are still machmir in these situations, but with when there's an issue of carrying a firearm for security threat, then you don't need an Eruv. So that's why the Rav Arashi there said that they can carry even those people who normally don't rely on an Eruv, they could still carry their weapon. Rav Shmuel Eliyahu offered more detailed instructions about the situation and included the following suggestions, specifically for those who serve as members of local security teams. Mutter lashir samachshar cellulari patoch b'Shabbat. You can leave your cell phone on during Shabbos. Almanat lekabel hatraot b'Shabbat le'ezor bo garim. Le'ezor bo garim, that they can get alerts in an area that they live. Mumlatz latino tome rosh. It's recommended that you charge it in advance. Avalim karami krev ain't phone must speak, but you don't have enough. Mutar latin gam Shabbos b'shinui. You can charge it in an unusual manner. Eitzel balei tafkidam bahem yesh tzorach bitchoni shutaf. Certainly for those who have a specific role on a constant basis for security. Okay. The Rav Shmuel Eliyahu continues. Adam shetzarich latzeit mimakom lamakom. Nitain listovev im hamachshir haniyad b'Shabbos b'kis gam b'makom she'ein bo eruv. He paskins that you're allowed to carry the cellular phone on Shabbos in a pocket without an eruv. Lachein afilu al sofik pikuach nefesh yotzim v'nosim barechev. Even if it's a sofik pikuach nefesh, you go in a car. Umishtamshin b'pelefon b'tzur regila. And you use it in a regular fashion, not to delay even for a second. Yesh deya shemishtamshim b'shinui im ze bevadot lo gorem tipa ikul. Some say do it as shinu if it's not even not to a second delay. Aval im yesh safek im gorem ikul v'arei sheyatz scharo b'efsedo. You're going to lose whatever benefit you gain. You're going to lose. L'chen yishtamesh kragil. For soldiers on active duty, the urgency of their functions in wartime is far greater. This extends not only to those in the field engaged in battling the enemy or tending to defensive posts, but also to those responsible for completing any of the many support tasks necessary for meeting the needs of the frontline soldiers. According to the directive issued by the Chief Rabbinate and Sahal for Operation Iron Swords, it's a mitzvah to perform every task that assists with the war effort. Accordingly, the situation demands that those tasked with responsibilities for the war effort must function on Shabbos the same as they do during the week, even without a shinui. This includes tasks necessary for running command and supply centers and all other operations of military support and manpower. Okay. Now we could come to another, so far we've learned about shinui as a method or methodology to avoid violating a Torah prohibition. We're going to see that, I don't know if we call them loopholes or exemptions. So there's another one we're going to see about the concept of kavana. That means, do you have intention to do this act or no intention? And we'll see whether malacha tzricha kavana or eino tzricha kavana. But before we get to kavana, we're going to deal with a more opaque or more oblique issue called malacha she'eino tzricha lagufa. Doing a malacha that's not required for I would say for its original intent. We noted that an act can be classified midaraisa as labor with respect to the provisions of Shabbos only when a number of conditions are met. The first of which was performing it in a typical manner, not with your left hand, not with your elbow. The second condition we will discuss relates to whether an act constitutes a forbidden labor, that whether an act constitutes a forbidden labor only when it is a malacha shetzrich legufa, a labor necessary for itself, or even if it's a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa, a labor which is not necessary for its own sake. The question relates to whether labor can be considered true malacha only if the action is being performed for its conventional, proper, constructive purpose. And we will see a number of sources which will help sharpen and illustrate this concept. The Mishnah records a Tanaitic dispute regarding whether one is liable for carrying something from a private domain to a public domain only to be rid of it, and not for the constructive purpose of bringing it to a place where it's needed. That's an example of a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa. So the malacha that's tzrich legufa is, we need a Sefer Torah in the shul. So I'm going to carry it from my house to the shul. And we need to deliver it there. That's a constructive act. But let's say I want to rid my house of garbage. I want to take it outside. Well, that may be more complicated. So because it smells, so you are doing something by removing it. But if you want to remove something from your house, not for a constructive purpose, bringing the item somewhere where you need it, you just want to remove it from where it is in your house, so that will be considered a malacha she'ein tzrich leguf. The Mishnah in Shabbos says, "Hamotzi es hameis b'mita chayiv." Person died in a house, and you transport the mace from inside to outside on his bed, you're chayiv. V'chein kezayis ben hameis, u'kezayis ben hanevela. A kezayis of a corpse. Now, a mace in the house brings tumas oil, that anything in the room, in the house, will become tameh. Same thing if you have a kezayis min ha-mace. Now, kezayis min ha-nevela is only tameh if you touch it. Or ka'adasha min ha-sheretz, if you have a dead sheretz, there are 8 types of creepy crawling, not necessarily insects. They're weasels, and a mole, and a mink, and certain types of lizards. Their corpse conveys tumah, even the size of a lentil bean. Now, so according to the Tanna Kama, you're removing it from your house because you don't want it in your house. It doesn't make a difference because the Tanna Kama holds melacha she'ein tzrich legufa chayav. Comes Rab Shimon and says potter. So Rab Shimon holds that a melacha she'ein performed not as a constructive act because I need an item somewhere, but because I'm trying to rid of my house of the item, then I would not be chayiv. The Mishnah discusses removing a corpse from one's home. Now, you're ostensibly violating the prohibition of Lotzah, and why are you doing it? Either to protect the home from the unpleasant odor of the corpse. In this instance, the person is not carrying the item for its own sake, in order to bring it somewhere specific. That's usually the purpose of carrying. People carry to bring something somewhere. This person is performing the act to achieve a different result, so that the unpleasant odor will not be in the home. According to the first Tana, you're still liable. That's Rabbi Yehuda. One is liable even in that case. While Rabbi Shimon holds that one does not violate the Torah prohibition when performing a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa. The Rishonim debate the precise definition of a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa, which could be described as not meeting the criteria for a malacha she'tzrich legufa. Rashi defines this as an act performed to meet the constructive purpose of the particular malacha. Rav Shimon Potter, afil b'mei shalim, even a complete corpse. Davi melacha shein tzrich legufa. V'chol melacha shein tzrich legufa, ela l'salka me'olav, any melacha. In this case, you just want to get rid of it. Avi melacha shein tzrich legufa. Dibritzona lo bo'olo. He didn't want this thing. He wanted to get rid of it. V'layat tzarich la. He didn't need it. Hilkach lav melachas machshavasi, Reb Shimon. It's a defect in a constructive labor. So he did a labor, but it didn't lead to a constructive outcome. Tosfos has a different definition. In their view, a labor is considered a melacha shetzrich legufa when its purpose is the same as the corresponding labor performed for the Mishkan. All of the 39 melachos were melachos that were required in some form and fashion in the functioning of the Mishkan. So Tosfos learns that melacha shein tzrich legufa is one of the examples that I remember going through Masechta Shabbos is they hunted. They hunted they needed the tchelas. They needed a dye. So they hunted for that purpose. So if you do it for another purpose, perhaps, says Tosfos, it would not be considered a melacha shetzrich leguf. Let's see what Tosfos says here. Nira l'ri, the melacha shein tzrich legufa kari kishoysa melacha vein tzarich lo so tzarich ke'ein shayid tzrichim la b'mishkan. You're not using it for the same purpose that the Mishkan used it. You're using it for another purpose. So you see, it's quite different than Rashi. Ki atzarich shayid melacha nasis b'shvilo b'mishkan hugufa melacha v'shorsho. The labor was performed a certain way in the Mishkan, so therefore lefi zeh asi kulu shaper otzasa meis ein tzarich lemeis. Here you're getting rid of the mace. Here, the mace is not being taken out because anybody needs to do anything with the mace. In the Mishkan, they carried because they needed it. When you carried it outside, they needed its function there. Other Rishonim offer a number of additional interpretations of Melacha shein tzrich legufa. The Ramban, Balamor, explain that it refers to any case in which no direct benefit is derived from the Melacha. While tzrich legufa refers to cases where what derives direct benefit from the law. So far we see three different approaches to how to find a melacha tzrich legufa. So returning to the Mishnah, the anonymous Tana, which the Gemara identifies as Rabbi Yehuda, holds that one is liable for melacha shein tzrich legufa no matter what. Doesn't make a difference. Whether it was done for the right purpose, not the right purpose, you're still chayiv. It's Reb Shimon who holds that if you do something a melacha shein tzrich legufa, it's not permitted. It's also midrabanan only. It's not chayiv midaraisa. Now, who do we paskin like? The Rambam rules that one is liable for a melacha shein tzrich legufa. He holds like Rav Yehuda. Kol osa melacha b'Shabbos, aval pi shein tzrich legufa shel melacha chayiv aleh. Ketzah. Harei shekaba saner mipnei shehu tzarich l'shemen o l'psila. So you have a flame, and you extinguish the flame because you didn't want the fire to burn up the shemen. You needed the shemen for another purpose, or the wick, kedei shelo yovad, or kedei shelo yisaref. You don't want it to be burned completely. Or kedei shelo yibaka cheres shel ner, or you don't want the pottery of the lamp. It doesn't make a difference. Chayiv. Extinguishing is a malacha. His kavana was to extinguish. It's, for example, why do you normally extinguish a light? Because you want it to be dark. But here he wasn't extinguishing it for that reason. He was extinguishing because he wanted to preserve the wick, or he wanted the oil. The Rambam doesn't care what your kavanas were. Your kavana was to extinguish. Whether it was, for whatever reason, the Rambam doesn't care why. He holds like Rabbi Yehuda that you're chayiv. Aval Pishin and Tzurch Legufa Kibuy V'Lokova El B'nei Hashemen. He only extinguished it because he wants the oil of B'nei Acheresh or B'nei Apsila. Still a Reza Chai. However, the Ravid, who is always the main bar plukt of the Rambam, the Rashba, an important posek for us, and other Rishonim disagreed and ruled that a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa is forbidden only Rabbanan. So the Ravid brings Rabbeinu Chananel pasuk Rab Shimon, Shehu Poiter, Midamin and Perek Noitel, Rabbik Rab Shimon Svirle. The Gemara there brings Rava that we hold like Rab Shimon. Damar malacha she'ein tzrich legufa potter aleh. And the Rashba there says ve'ein v'anan kamin and Rab Shimon de potter. So, what position is adopted in halacha today? So, when discussing two different malachas, so trapping animals, like we talked about tzad, and extinguishing kibui, the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with the majority view, which is to be lenient, but he mentions the stricter position of the Rambam. If he hunted shar shrotzim, the hatzodin letzorech, now, for whatever reason, he wants this animal, and that's why he hunted it. So that's why they hunted animals in the time of the Mishkan. They needed whatever that animal provided for it, the skin, right? The goat skins, the very skins they used, etc. You needed the animal. That was the malacha shetzrich legufa. Now, let's say shalol tzarech. You didn't want the animal. You wanted to get rid of the animal, right? Ostam, or let's say you were hunting for pleasure. Patra v'loser. He's going like the Rambam, like the Rashba and the Ravid. That a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa, like Rab Shimon, that it's potter. But he says, Rambam chayiv. In another place, by a coal that is burning, gachelet hamunachat b'mokum sherabim nizokim ba. You're out in the public on Wilshire Boulevard, and there's a hot coal, and people could get damaged by it. Yachol kabosa, you can extinguish it. Bein im hishel matechas, whether it's metal, bein im hishel eitz, whether it's wood. V'Rambam oyser b'shel eitz. The Rambam prohibited if it was made out of wood. The Mishnah Berurah explains that in this case, the concern for safety permits someone to perform an act which would otherwise be forbidden midrabanan. It's still only a rabbinic act, but because of safety, you're allowed to do it. In the view of the Rambam, the concern for safety in this case, we obviously are talking where there's no threat to people's lives, because then you'd be allowed to do it. But here there's no sakana, so it does not permit an act which would be forbidden according to the Torah. But in any case, the Mishnah Berurah adds that we don't follow the Rambam. Halacha accords with Rab Shimon, the Rashba, and the Ravid, that malacha she'ein tzrich legufa is potter. The kibush shechayv in Torah davka kishemechayv lasas b'chamim. Now, what was the extinguishing going on in the Mishkan? They needed coals. So the purpose for extinguishing was to create a coal. But here you're not extinguishing for that reason. So extinguishing for any other reason than to make a coal would be a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa. Stam kibu, you have a malacha she'ein tzrich legufa. Vurak yisur drabanan. Uv'makam hezeket derabim. So this is a new concept. It's not pikuach nefesh. But if there's public danger, so you can violate an isur drabanan. V'makam hezeket derabim sheyichlu li nazek begufan loy gazru. Now remember, what are Isurei Drabanan? Minat Torah, you're allowed to do it. The Rabbanon said don't do it because they're being goizer. They're trying to prevent us from doing worse malacha. So the concept is, if the Chachamim knew that the public was in danger, they wouldn't be goizer in that situation. So that's why the rabbinic Isser falls away. Aval b'malkam ezeka d'mamona aser. It's only someone if there's danger to people's health, if there's danger to money, that's why you're not allowed to extinguish a fire on Shabbos. Today it's more complicated because it might be your neighbor, and there's Ava, and maybe Isik Pikuach Nefesh. But in general, the Gemara does not allow us to put out a dlek on Shabbos because your possessions are being burned. Here we see b'mokam hazeka de b'mona aser. Now the Mishnah Berurah says a Rambam Sfir the Chayiv Melacha Shein Tzurich Kach Aser B'Shel Eitz. The halacha kedei rishona, but the halacha follows the first shot. The Yalkut Yosef writes that the majority of poskim disagree with the Rambam and rule that a malacha shein tzrich leguf is forbidden only midrabanan. As indicated, because the malacha of extinguishing was specifically characterized as the purposeful making of full, most instances of extinguishing today will qualify as malacha shein tzrich legufa. Thus, the Mishnah Berurah writes that the act of extinguishing bisman hazeh is only midrabanan. Now, you're still not allowed to do it, but b'makom, whatever, b'makom hazeka derabim, maybe cholashi ein bo sakana, maybe l'shem mitzvah, we'll see. L'kach nikras malacha shein tzrich legufa, shari ein tzrich l'takas hamalacha, ki ein tzrich l'kibu b'shel atzmo, ela shemachabib b'nei einyan. He's extinguishing kagon kadeshi yishana chola. He wanted to be dark so the person who is sick will be able to sleep. Or shuchas al Hashem, you want to preserve the oil. Shebener shlo yidlak kulo akshav. Or shuchas al cheres haner, or you don't want the pottery to get ruined. Shlo yiskalka b'nei chozek adlaka. Or shemechabe eitzim dolkim b'nei shechas alem, or you have wooden logs that you want to preserve. Or shemechabe sadleika b'nei shechas al mamono, or he's putting out a fire because of concern about his property. He's not making coals. All these things are just malacha shein tzrich legufa, which is also midrabanan. Kol zeh mikri eino tzrich legufa sharei eino mechavin l'tachas lamalacha atzma, because you're not doing the kibui the way that it was done in the Mishkan, or the way the malacha was normally done to make a coal. Somebody digs a ditch. You don't want the ditch, you want the dirt. Now normally this malacha of making a ditch, you're chayv in the house because of bona, and in the soda because of chorish. But keva de'ein tzarich leguma, you don't want the ditch, you want them dirt. Having malacha shein tzarich legufa. Ve'en lecha kibuy tzarich legufa ela kishu mechabe eitzim k'dei lasas mem pchamid. The only extinguishing that would fulfill malacha shetzrich legufa is when you're trying to take wood and make coals out of them. The halos tzarich legufa malacha sharei yefshel lasos pchamim lo sheyichbeh. In any case, it's important to emphasize again that even according to Reb Shimon, a malacha shein tzarich legufa is still normally forbidden, barring exceptional circumstances. Moreover, the Mishnah Berurah later writes that a malacha shein tzarich legufa is treated more severely than an ordinary Issur D'Rabbanan on Shabbos, since the act itself can sometimes be done in a manner which would violate a Torah prohibition. So malacha shein tzarich legufa is not a great leniency. It's got certain stringencies to it. See also Sharat Sion, discussing a case of uncertainty regarding killing an animal in case of malacha shein tzarich legufa, where the ruling is still a stringent one. Similarly, the Mishnah Berurah is stringent concerning malacha shein tzarich legufa during twilight, even in case of need for a mitzvah, for which a rabbinic prohibition is normally waived. Since the malacha shein tzarich legufa may be more severe, so you see the normal heterim that we have by Issur D'Rabbanan is not completely holding. 264. Dover sheina miskavein. We said, just like there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon regarding malacha shein tzarich legufa, throughout Masechta Shabbos, there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon regarding if you have no kavana for the malacha that you're doing. Thus far, we have discussed two conditions which help to define and identify meleches machsheves, an action which would be considered a labor midaraisa. As evinced by the term itself, meleches machsheves is a deliberate and conscious act. The Gemara records that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon disagree regarding dragging furniture across the ground on Shabbos, as dragging the furniture, of course, if you had a dirt floor, might unintentionally produce a furrow in the ground. According to Reb Shimon, it's permitted. You wanted to move your chair from one corner to another. You had no intention of making a ditch. You made a ditch on the way. It's malacha she'eina miskavin, and it's permitted. An action which might unintentionally result in labor. Rabbi Yehuda forbids it over Shem Miskavin. And the Omoraim debate whether the halacha is with Rav Yehuda or Rav Shimon. Rav Amar, ein halacha Rav Shimon begreira. The halacha is not like Rav Shimon in this dragging a chair business. Ushmul Amar halacha Rav Shimon begreira. Amar Abaya, kol mili demar avid kirav. He's talking about his teacher Rabbah, that Rabbah always followed Rav. Lebar Mahani Tlas David Kishmuel, except for three things they did like Shmuel. V'halach Reb Shimon begreira. And therefore the halach is like Reb Shimon begreira. The Tanya Reb Shimon Omer, goyrer odemita kisei v'saf. So you can drag a bed, a chair, or a bench. L'vachlo iskavin, as long he doesn't have intention to make the ditch. And the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with Reb Shimon and permits a davar she'eina miskavin, provided that a person's action will not necessarily result in a forbidden labor. We're going to see the concept of the psik resha, not this week. If it's automatically going to produce that, then you're not allowed to do it. It means if you know for sure that you're going to do an act where the secondary thing is going to occur, then davar she'eina miskavin mutter v'hu shli'ei psik resha. The psik resha, it means psik resha means to cut off the head. Now they were cutting off the head. They needed the blood. So, but you're going to kill the animal. So you think, even though you needed the blood, I didn't have kavanah to, but the animal's going to die no matter what. That's a psik resha, and it would be forbidden even according to Reb Shimon. But dragging a bed or a chair is not necessarily absolutely going to make a ditch. So therefore, as long as he didn't have kavanah to make the chritz, and as long as it's not automatically going to make the chritz. Similarly, although there's a risk that a person might uproot grass while walking across it, the Shulchan Aruch writes that you're allowed to walk on grass on Shabbos. Muter leilech al gabi asavim, ben lachim ben yeveshin, kevan she'ena miskavin litlosh. You don't have intention to uproot the grass. Rav Shneur Zalman Milyadi, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, writes in the Shulchan Aruch Harav that one is permitted to do so even barefoot, although blades of grass may be cut between the toes. Muter leich al gabi asavim b'Shabbos afilo leich yachev, even barefoot. Efshar shibu kasavim b'kishre it's supposed to be yitlashu. You might pull out some of the grass. Another practical application of the rule of davar she'eina miskavin pertains to running fingers through one's hair on Shabbos. The Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasar permits running one's fingers through one's hair on Shabbos, since such an action will not necessarily cause hairs to be detached, which would be gozes. Therefore, it qualifies as a davar she'eina miskavin. Mutar adam l'chachech benachas, to smooth your hair. B'saras rosh v'skeno. You're not concerned, you're going to pluck it. Let's say you have food in your beard. You can remove it, as long as he's not going to detach any hairs. Brushing or combing one's hair will be discussed later. The poskim also discuss whether someone may brush your teeth when there's a chance that this will cause the gums to bleed. The person doesn't intend to cause bleeding, and it's not certain that the gums will bleed. So the tzitzal yeruza, there's no prohibition. The kain ein amitzius kain david psik resha sheyetzidem. It's not 100% that the blood's going to come, so it's not a psik resha, and therefore would be permitted. The same principle of davar she'eina miskavin is also permitted to permit other actions on Shabbos that may potentially cause a malacha to be violated, such as pulling paper towels from a paper towel dispenser. These have been fully separated or pre-cut, when it's possible that some towels will be inadvertently torn by the pulling. Other cases of davar she'eina miskavin will be discussed in the next few volumes on Hilchos Shabbos. Okay, we'll leave Pseik Reisha to next week because there's a little bit more that goes into it. And then you'll have Misasek, and then we'll have Grama. So these are the general sort of loopholes where you might get away with not violating a full biblical prohibition. Comments, questions, Har wrote.
I just point out that Molach Shem Trichel Gufa is also M'Rabanan, and Mischavan is Mutter. It's
Correct.
entirely Mutter.
It's not Potter of Allah. And not only that, you saw how normally a mitzvah drabanan, like if it's tzibur or mitzvah, you might be able to do that thing. You saw the Mishnah Berurah doesn't allow us malacha shein tzrich legufa. There's a certain stringency to it, which is very interesting.
Which does not apply to Davar Shein Mischavan, which is Mutter.
Correct. Absolutely. Okay, we're into very heavy duty learning.